into the detail of the employers' options and the obligations that they have from an industrial perspective. Before we do, given that at Mappian, we really take a multidisciplinary approach, as I said, and it's not just about the legal answer. As an experienced industrial relations practitioner, is there anything you want to say in terms of context for employers when they're making decisions about the legal options in front of them that are important to think about when you make those choices as an employer?
Thanks, Nadia. Certainly, and this is not necessarily a legal answer, it's more a kind of practical answer, is that there's lots of challenges from a legal and structural industrial framework at the moment because our system has never really contemplated the sort of unprecedented crisis that we are currently facing as a country and as a society. And I think the one thing that is most important is the continual communication, not just with your employees, but all of your various stakeholders in your business. And I think that getting the employees to understand where your business is placed, the challenges that it's facing that may appear currently to be insurmountable, but it's a shared challenge. It's not a challenge that we as managers can kind of address in isolation. We need to have our employees coming along with us and supporting us in the endeavours that we're putting in place to make our businesses survive the next period of time and the uncertainty associated, whether that's 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 weeks. No one knows. No one has those answers currently. So it's really about getting the employees aligned with the goals that we're seeking at the moment.
Sounds like good advice, Alex, and that would come down to communication. And I guess unprecedented seems to be the word of 2020 other than COVID-19. And I guess that refers back to the point that Jason made before, that it's okay to say that you don't know at this stage. What you do have to do is provide them with as much certainty as possible in those communications. So that makes sense from an industrial perspective too. Okay, so let's turn to those specific questions that every employer is asking our business right now. And one of the most common other words we're hearing a lot is stand down. So that most businesses would not have experienced a situation before where they've had to consider that type of response. Can you explain, Alex, what is a stand down and when should employers be looking to use that arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, a stand down is a particular arrangement which is permitted by the Fair Work Act, which essentially allows an employer to stand down employees without pay if a stoppage of work occurs for a reason which is beyond the control or responsibility of the employer. The textbook examples around stand down is normally, breakdown of machinery, a problem in a supply chain, a cyclone has kind of closed businesses, floods, fires. They're your textbook stand down scenarios, but certainly COVID-19 in its broadest kind of context, but in particular having regard to specific responses taken by governments to control the spread of the infection, are providing triggers for businesses to stand down employees without pay. This is not to say that every single business in Australia can stand down their employees. You have to look at the particular situations and circumstances. Some are more obvious than others. So, working in hospitality, in restaurants, in events, catering, the current kind of bans on those activities are an obvious stand down trigger. For other employers working in retail or wholesale, in those sorts of areas, there's a significant downturn in business, but it's a bit more challenging sometimes to draw the connection to be sufficient to be a trigger for stand down.
And is it possible to stand down parts of your business as opposed to the whole business at once?
Yeah, it is. And we often confuse stand down with shut down. Now, sometimes they go hand in hand. So if you shut down the entirety of your operations, then you don't have a capacity to employ people, and therefore there's an opportunity to stand down. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to shut down the entirety of your operation. So again, kind of, using a fairly obvious example, a stadium. Suncorp Stadium in Brisbane, no longer allowed to have the Broncos play there. So all of the event day staff can be stood down without pay, but there's still a capacity to usefully employ some employees behind the scenes to maintain the fields, to clean what is required to be cleaned, to do maintenance and those sorts of things. So just because a significant number of employees are required to be stood down doesn't necessarily mean that all do. And in fact, there's a positive obligation under the Act to identify whether employees can be usefully employed or not. And usefully employed is a determination made by the employer. So, in past less serious scenarios, I've had unions come and say, well, you can't stand down those employees because they could be raking the gardens or painting the rocks or doing an inane, unnecessary task. An activity is not usefully employed. Usefully employed means there are roles and functions which an employer needs to be undertaken to continue business.
Okay. And in that situation where you've got some employees you're standing down and some you're not, and maybe they usually have the same job, how do you pick which ones you stand down and which ones you give the other work to?
With a very heavy heart. It's a very, very difficult decision. And having these discussions with owner managers on a day-to-day basis is really, it's really quite difficult. You can't play favourites. You have to treat everyone the same, but you can't help but feel for the clients.
Alex, I know you've been heavily involved in supporting some of our clients who have massive operations and are standing down thousands of employees at the moment, so we understand. Belinda, I might turn to you now, just to give Alex a moment. In terms of selecting employees in this situations, can you give any other guidance as to what might be fair selection criteria?
Sorry, Nadia, I was on mute. Look, I think that, we all acknowledge the stress in this situation, and Alex has seriously been right on the front line dealing with some very difficult situations. So the situation in terms of selecting staff, at the end of the day, you need to look at who has the skills, who has the capability to be able to continue the work that has to be done. It needs to be a fair process in that you have to make sure that you're not picking someone because they're the manager's favourite or something like that. You do need to have some criteria around making sure that you're looking specifically at what skills they have, what experience they have. You might even start to look at some things like, have they been with the business for a long period of time and things like that. But it's just trying to make sure that the employees can see that there's a fair process. Look, I think the reality is this is a very stressful process for everybody. And I know we deal with a lot of smaller, medium and very large businesses. And the thing that's becoming clear at the moment is people are just in shock. And we're getting asked on a daily basis, employers are saying, you should be paying out my annual leave. If you're going to stand me down for a couple of weeks, you need to be paying me my annual leave. The stand down principles don't necessarily enable you to do that. It require you to do that. Stand down is about a period of time where there's no work. And if you can give people annual leave, because you can afford to give people annual leave, then that's okay. But if you can't, then that's what the stand down principles are there for. Someone just asked a quick question. Sorry, Nadia, I saw it pop up on my screen. About last on, first off. No, I'm not necessarily supporting last on, first off, but what I'm saying is you need to look at a variety of different aspects. I mean, if you've got someone who really understands your business because they've been in that business for a long period of time and can quickly answer questions and quickly find solutions and things like that, then they may be the person who's who's best to select to not stand down and to continue working. It's a complex issue. You just have to look at all the variables, but try and make it look and make it as fair as possible.
Thanks, Belinda. And it makes sense, obviously, because in the situation with a stand down, generally speaking, employers don't have the cash to pay out accrued leave entitlements. So the ability to stand down without having to pay leave is going to be critical for survival of employers. I guess one question that I've seen coming up, and I've missed to either Alex or to Belinda, what if you're looking at a situation where you have some work available, and you're looking to stand, one option is to stand people down, but you have some work. Can you turn to your full-time employees and say, look, I've got enough work for everyone if you all go part-time, but if you don't, you know, I'll have to stand some of you down. Like, can you make people go part-time in this situation?
That's a question that's in a state of flux. So late yesterday afternoon, the Fair Work Commission made an amendment to the hospitality award, which now allows employers to effectively reduce the hours of full-time and part-time employees by 40%. So that's an unusual scenario. We've never seen a clause like that in an award previously, but I'm expecting that will start to flow through to a number of industry-based awards. So in that scenario, yes, you could direct a reduction across the board to up to 40%. In the circumstances before that, which is facing most other employers, you can't force someone to go part-time. But what you can do is you can put the options up to them. And the options are, we're considering leave without pay across the board unless we can get people to agree as a collective to this outcome. Or alternatively, you can say, we are standing everyone down and it's leave without pay, but we are making these part-time hours available for those that wish to perform that work. If everyone performs, it's the same outcome. If only half of them perform, it may be better for those that remain because they will have more hours available, assuming that you can spread the hours equally.
And in terms of the status of an employee when they are stood down, are they still employed, and are there any entitlements that do apply during that period?
Stand down is without pay. They're still employed. So it doesn't trigger redundancy, and I've seen a number of questions like that come through. So if you stand down employees, it does not trigger redundancy. And in fact, in the current climate, that's exactly why people are being stood down, because there is no money available for redundancies. Now, the period that this stand down can continue, again, we use the unprecedented word, they don't normally extend for more than 2, 3, 4 weeks. This could extend for months and months. And at some point in time, some of the employers and businesses that have stood down employees will make the difficult decision to shut. At that point, a redundancy is triggered, but until that decision is made, and presumably that won't be until the COVID-19 crisis is largely resolved, there is no redundancy trigger. And that's important because, large-scale redundancies could force many employers to the wall. So stand down is a way to avoid that additional financial burden.
Nadia, if I could just add something following on from that, the issue of stand down, that the employees are still in effect employed, it doesn't necessarily prevent them in terms of Centrelink and things like that. And a number of employers that we've been working with have actually given a letter to the employees advising them of the situation, and then the employees have then gone to Centrelink. So even though they're still employed, they're going through a period of no pay. So I haven't spoken to Centrelink about this, but I know a number of our clients have been writing letters to enable the employees to take it to Centrelink.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Belinda. I think a lot of employers are looking at how different options they apply might affect Centrelink payments. And while we're not advisors in that area, certainly the accountants we work with have advised that they do have access to those benefits as if they had been laid off rather than were stood down. So as opposed to if they were receiving paid leave during the period. There's a question here in terms of what if employees then quit during the stand down period? Is there any change? Is that just a basic resignation, or are they entitled to redundancy at that point?
No, if they resign, there's no capacity for an employer to stop that. The only reason why an employee practically would resign during this period would be to get access to their accrued leave entitlements if the leave entitlements were not made available to them. So some employers are facing disastrous financial consequences. They can't afford to pay leave. They'd love to be able to pay employees their accrued leave during this period, but they don't have the money to do so. So they're holding that back. Once an employee resigns and a termination is triggered, then a payment would be required to be made. Now, if any of the participants online today are in that situation, if someone resigns, they're required to give you notice. So you could drag it out to the end of the notice period, either in the award or the contract, before you would have to trigger that payment. But that would be the legal obligation then.
And obviously in that situation, Alex, if they're stood down, you're not actually paying them during that notice period, are you?
No, that's right. They're not being paid. No.
Yeah. And is it correct that during the stand down period, leave accrues, and is superannuation treated differently in any way?
There is a provision in the Fair Work Act which allows for leave accrued under the Fair Work Act to continue during a period of stand down. So the most obvious ones there would be annual leave and personal leave. That doesn't extend to long service leave, because long service leave is governed by state legislation and it differs from state to state. Now, I can't give the answer for every state, but I know I've looked in Queensland and Victoria, and in both of those states, it doesn't accrue. So long service leave does not accrue during the period of the stand down.
Thank you. And so once we get to hopefully this end of the period, everyone keeps saying the bridge to the other side. Once we reach that point and you're looking at your needs, and Alex, you kind of referred before to, at that point you might decide whether there's a redundancy or not at the end, whether if you can't bring them back. Is there any sort of rule around who you bring back, and is a redundancy triggered at that point or do you have to offer them their job back first? Are there any obligations around that?
It's a brave new world. No one's really faced this kind of long-term stand down, so there's no rules. We make up the rules as we go, but the organisation that we were pre-COVID-19 and the organisation that we will be post-COVID-19 is likely to be radically different. So people will need to determine, or organisations will need to determine who are the right employees that they need in the business moving forward to make it successful in whatever form that it takes. And that would be no different to any sort of major restructuring decision where you look at skill, you look at fit, and you select the most appropriate persons who will allow the organisation to succeed.
And as an example of that, one of our participants has asked about, I guess, the selection criteria of casual versus full-time. Is there any obligation to treat full-time employees preferentially to casuals, for example?
In a return to work scenario?
Yes.
It would make sense to do it. I mean, it would depend on what the roles were, but if you didn't re-engage a full-timer at that point, that would trigger redundancy payments, and that would have obviously a commercial impact. The decision not to re-engage a casual employee will not have a particular financial impact in that regard. So it's really about appropriate skill mix, and you may still need a mix of full-time, part-time and casual employees in the organisation in its new structure.
One question, Alex. Can you force people to take annual leave or long service leave instead of, say, a shutdown or redundancy?
No, you can't force them, but you can put them in a position where it is a much better option than the alternative. So you basically say, we'll need to stand you down without pay unless you wish to avail yourself of your accrued annual leave or long service leave. If they choose not to, then they'll leave without pay.
And I think, does that depend on, sometimes you see in agreements there is an ability to direct people to take leave. Would that be an exception to that?
Yeah, because we're not directing, we're getting their agreement. We're just putting a context where agreement seems to be the obvious outcome. There are some industrial instruments that allow for the taking of annual leave on short periods of notice, but generally awards of 4 weeks. But the hospitality award, which I mentioned earlier, was amended yesterday, now allows for that to occur on 24 hours notice. So that's the only award that currently has that sort of very narrow time frame.
Okay, and 2 more questions. You did discuss stand down and you mentioned that employees would still accrue their leave entitlements during that period. Is it possible to ask employees to take leave without pay, which obviously doesn't accrue those entitlements?
No, it's the same. In that period, if you're stood down, then you would accrue. If you go to someone and say, oh, we're thinking about what to do, are you prepared to take leave without pay voluntarily? Well, then technically, yes, it would not accrue, but it is very much splitting hairs. And I think it probably will come back to bite someone culturally later on, and fairness and values of the organisation.